13 Tales Told by a Dubliner, by Turlough con me. Story number 6. The Golem of Ballybough. There was a Jewish cemetery in Ballybough, just down by Dublin Bay, in a place they called Mud Island. All the local Jews were buried there. If you went in there, you'd see gravestones with Hebrew inscriptions on them. The names were mostly Portuguese at first, because that was where they hailed from. The Jewish cemetery had a problem. The gravestones were likely to be stolen. The locals helped themselves to them, especially the old ones. In 1848, Isaac Fonseca visited a Christian neighbour and was puzzled to find a stone slab with Hebrew writing on it cemented into the chimney breast. On examination, it turned out to be his own grandfather's gravestone. There was another problem. The sack-em-ups were active. Those were men who came around in the dead of night to cemeteries and stole newly buried bodies and sold them to the medical students. The Jewish cemetery was not free from their depredations because they were accustomed to try their luck at another cemetery that was close by. The suicide plot, the occupants of which were buried with a stake through their hearts. This was unconsecrated ground of any religion, and suicides had to be buried there. It was also a place where executed thieves, murderers, and highwaymen were buried. In the meantime, the Jewish congregation in Ballybough had acquired a new rabbi. His name was Benjamin Davidoff. He had come to them from London, but originally he hailed from Prague in the imperial dominions. He sailed to Dublin in the year 1855. After he'd set himself and his household up in Ballybough, he applied himself with energy to organising the affairs of the community, which must have numbered about 1,000 souls at this stage. One day not long after his arrival, the president of the synagogue, Mr. Moses Pereira, and the secretary, Mr. Solomon de Souza, came to see the rabbi on a matter of urgent business. What concerned them, as it turned out, was the already mentioned thefts of headstones and even the bodies of the dead from the Ballybough cemetery. "The whole community is disturbed by this," said Mr. Pereira hotly. "The effrontery of some of our Christian neighbours knows no bounds. They seem to think it quite allowable to take inscribed headstones from the cemetery for use in building. We have been loath to make a fuss, as it's bound to bring down hostility on our heads from the locals. We just want to lead a quiet life as Jews do in London, where you come from." "Not only that," said Mr. de Souza, "but we are getting unwelcome attention from the sack-em-ups. We know you have them in London too. The problem is that there is a suicide plot near our cemetery. The sack-em-ups go there often in search of fresh bodies, and because our cemetery is so close, and there are of course godless men—" "Godless, absolutely godless," broke in Mr. Pereira, "with no respect even for their own Christian dead. They seem to have got the idea that they can prey on our own recent dead now too," went on Mr. de Souza. "Old Solomon de Silva, may God have mercy on his soul, was only a few days in his grave when they came and stole his body away. That was just last week, before you came. So we implore you, sir, as your first priority, to find a solution to this grievous problem affecting the dead," concluded Mr. Pereira. "We hardly know what to suggest. We have made representations to the British authorities here, but they seem to have little interest or concern for the lost sheep of Israel." Rabbi Davidoff was clearly concerned about what he was being told. He thought for a while, and then he said, "There is something I must look up in my books of learning. Give me tonight to study them, and come back at the same time tomorrow. I should be able to give you a satisfactory answer then." Mr. Pereira and Mr. de Souza readily agreed to this. As they made their way homewards together, they wondered aloud what the rabbi might be looking for in his books of learning. Perhaps a foundation in Jewish law for him to make representation to the secular courts? Or perhaps some mighty curse that a past rabbi had pronounced on grave robbers, which could be used again. But little did they guess what a range of books and experience the new rabbi had from his days in Prague. When they went to see him the following day, they found him in his parlour, poring over several Hebrew manuscripts. "Gentlemen," said the rabbi, "be of good cheer. I well remember hearing in Prague that a predecessor of mine, a well-known rabbi 100 years or more ago, had to deal with many threats and underhanded tricks against the Jews, thought up by the Goyim there, both priests and laymen. He used his knowledge from the esoteric writings to create a creature, not quite human, but to some extent intelligent, who obeyed him and who protected the Jews against these threats. For example, when a fanatical Christian preacher was telling the people of Prague that stupid old lie about Jews sacrificing Christian children for their blood, this creature was given instructions to stop all carts coming into the ghetto and inspect them. For the worst of the Goyim planned to carry bodies of children who had died and dump them on the streets of the ghetto. Then the Jews could be blamed. So this creature, the Golem as he was called, put a stop to the carry-on and saved the ghetto from attack." "Very good," said Mr. Pereira. "So do you think we need the same thing here?" The rabbi nodded. "But how would we do it?" asked Mr. de Souza. The rabbi gestured to the manuscripts open before him. "I have here notes I brought with me from Prague, and they give a complete account of how the golem was made. With God's help, we might be able to construct such a creature here, who could watch over the cemetery and deal with the malefactors." "Excellent," the two men exclaimed. "Let us do it then, if you just show us how." The rabbi gathered up his manuscripts and told them to follow him out of the house and down to the sea beyond Mud Island. The tide was out. They walked through the graveyard, then out to Mud Island, and here the rabbi stopped. "This looks like the kind of sandy mud we need," said the rabbi. "What we need to do is to gather together enough and construct the figure of a man, but larger and more powerful even than an average man. For as we build him, so will he be." They rolled up their sleeves and set to work with a will, and after an hour or so they had constructed the figure of a very large man out of the dark mud that lay before them. Consulting his manuscripts for details, the rabbi gave him a crudely shaped face, hands and feet. "Now comes the crucial part," said the rabbi thoughtfully. "We have to do exactly what God did in the 7 days of creation, or afterwards, when he created man. Remember what he did? Scripture tells us that he fashioned him out of the clay of the earth and then breathed into his nostrils so that he came to life." So saying, the rabbi consulted his manuscripts again and pronounced a Hebrew prayer. Then he bent over the body of the creature and breathed energetically into his nostrils. Then he got up and pronounced another Hebrew prayer. The golem, for such he was, began to stir like a man lying asleep, and then he opened his eyes. He was clearly alive. He even sat up, though he looked very sleepy. He is only beginning to get the life coursing through him, explained the rabbi. But soon enough he will be more lively. Pay attention now to what I am going to do. He took a steel penknife from his pocket, and with the sharp blade of it, he began inscribing something on the golem's broad forehead. It was a Hebrew word. The rightmost letter was Aleph, the next was Mim, the leftmost was Tav. Now, said the rabbi quietly to the other two, I have inscribed in his flesh the word Emet, which, as you know, means truth. That means he will always be at the service of truth. But if I erase the first letter, Aleph, and he did so using the flat of the penknife, the word becomes just Met, which means dead. And dead he will be until I choose to revive him with a fresh Aleph. Sure enough, the golem slumped onto his back, closed his eyes, and gave every appearance of being in a deep sleep. Go now and bring the handcart from the graveyard, the rabbi told the two men, and also something like a curtain to cover him. Then, without attracting any attention, we will bring him into my house, where he will be kept. We do not want any of the goyim to know of our secret. The president and the secretary did as they were bidden, and then the golem was brought into the rabbi's house. The rabbi's wife, who was let in on the secret, took the golem's approximate measurements and busied herself making him some clothes out of the old curtain that covered him. That night, the rabbi and his wife went down to where the golem was in the cellar. They put his new clothes on, and well they fitted him, a tunic and trousers of black woolen material. Then the rabbi inscribed a new Aleph on the right of his forehead, and he came to life. The rabbi looked at him and chuckled. You are a fine fellow, my friend. Big and strong you are. Now, here is what you are to do. I will take you out to the cemetery of the Jews nearby, and you are to stand guard there all night, driving away any one of the goyim who might come in and try to steal headstones or bodies. When it is getting to be dawn, come back here, and do not let anyone else see you. So the golem followed the rabbi up the stairs from the cellar, down the hall, out of the house, and over to the cemetery. He sniffed the sea air and grunted contentedly. Then he went and sat in the shadow of a wall. Good night, my friend, whispered the rabbi to him. Remember to do all I told you. The rabbi went back to his house and slept soundly, knowing that the Jews at the cemetery were enjoying their eternal rest, undisturbed till Judgment Day. And in the grey light of dawn, as the tide was ebbing beyond Mud Island, the golem strode back to the house. He knocked at the door, and the rabbi, who was at his morning prayers be now, rose and let him in, still wearing his tefillin and tzitzit, and with a prayer book in his hand. Good, he said to the golem, who seemed to know him now. All was quiet, I suppose. Down now into the cellar with you. Sleep and rest, or whatever you need to do during the day, and when it is dark, I will come and fetch you again. And so it was. The golem went out to spend his time on guard duty at the cemetery every night. One night a man came to get a gravestone, and the golem got up and laid his hand on his shoulder. The man looked around, saw the monster, and fled in terror. The same happened another night. Word spread around Ballybough that the Jewish cemetery was haunted by a terrible ghost. So men no longer went there in the night hours, looking for choice stone slabs. The sack-em-ups came with their cart another night, when they'd been at the suicide plot and thought they'd drop in to see if there were any new graves. The golem rose up, attacked them, beat them with their own shovels, and threw them out onto the road. The horse with the cart bolted and fled in terror. That was the last the place saw of the sack-em-ups. The following week, the rabbi sent out the golem to recover stolen headstones. Some of these were to be found in gardens and set into walls, and with his great strength he worked them loose and brought them back. Stories began to circulate about a vengeful ghost that was coming around Ballybough at night, taking stones from walls. And since these stones were stolen from a cemetery anyway, the householders had little reason to complain to the peelers. The rabbi had heard the story of Isaac Fonseca finding his grandfather's gravestone set into a chimney, so he told the golem about it and about the house where it was now to be found. The golem nodded and went on his way. Pat O'Rourke was having a quiet evening at home, relaxing with Dodd whiskey. He nodded off in front of a cosy fire. He woke up suddenly sometime after midnight to see a huge unearthly figure standing over him and pointing to a stone in the chimney breast adorned with Hebrew letters. He was frightened out of his wits. Without further ado, the golem, for it was he, turned and with his great strength seized the headstone and ripped it out of the place where it was cemented. Then he nodded threateningly at Pat, gathered up the headstone under his mighty oxter, and stalked out of the house, leaving the chimney breast in ruins, but the fire still burning in the hearth. When the family came down to see what was going on, they found Pat alone, gibbering to himself about the creature he'd seen. They had to send him away for the sake of his health, somewhere down the country. But the story spread around Ballybough and struck fear into the hearts of the guilty. The golem did some things on his own initiative too. When he was standing guard at the Jewish cemetery, he would occasionally hear the sack-em-ups at their grisly trade whenever a new occupant had been added to the suicide plot. Then he would march over there, belabour the diggers with their own shovels, take the body back out of the cart, stake and all sticking out of it, and with groans of commiseration place it back tenderly in its grave and cover it with earth again. Then he picked up the stunned diggers and threw them and their shovels into the back of the cart. He gave the horse a mighty blow on its hindquarters and it stampeded back into town. One day, a little boy appeared at the rabbi's door. "Please, sir," said this boy, who looked about 9 or 10 years old, "can I talk to you?" "If you like," said the rabbi. "What's your name then?" "Bram Stoker, if you please, sir," said the little boy. "Abraham, eh? Well, that's a nice Jewish name." "Oh no, sir, we're not Jewish, we're Protestants." "And you're Abraham?" "I usually am called Bram for short." "Ah, yes," said the rabbi. "You know, before he became Abraham, Abraham was called just Abram. But God called him Abraham because that meant he was to be the father of many." "Oh, I prefer to be Bram, sir. I don't intend to have any children when I grow up." "Oh, I see," said the rabbi, not seeing at all. "An Abraham who's not Jewish and who prefers to be Abram." He chuckled. "So what brings you to talk to the rabbi?" The little boy paused for a moment. Then he said in a sort of a conspiratorial whisper, "I've seen him, sir." "Who?" The strange man who stands guard at your cemetery every night. He even guards the suicide plot further up towards our house." The rabbi's eyes bulged at this. Why don't you come inside, and my wife will give you a cup of tea. No need to stand and talk at the door where everyone can hear." So the little boy went into the parlour and sat down with the rabbi, and the rabbi's wife made tea. "How do you know about what's going on in cemeteries, little boy?" asked the rabbi. "That's no place for little boys to be, especially at night." "Well, sir, I see from my bedroom window what's going on up the road, which is where your cemetery and the suicide plot are. Then I find cemeteries interesting. There's all kinds of stories about them. I even make up my own. So anyway, I found out about the man, if he is a man. Who or what is he, sir?" "Am I supposed to know?" said the rabbi with a slight smile. "Well, sir, I think he's kind of your servant, so you must know all about him. There's something very peculiar about him. He doesn't look human. He's supernatural." "Did he come in from the sea, sir? Is that it? There are supposed to be strange creatures out in the sea that wander into land at low tide." "Actually, you're quite right," said the rabbi with a helpless shrug. "He is my servant. He is my creature, in fact. I know how to make creatures like him. And yes, I suppose you could say he came in from the sea. He is made from the mud of Mud Island." "And he's the one who's going around taking back the headstones, isn't he?" "I dare say he is," chuckled the rabbi. "Enterprising fellow, yes?" "Oh, yes, sir. We haven't got any headstones, by the way, in case you were wondering." "Good." "I'd like to be friends with him," said the little boy. "He doesn't seem to have any friends." "And so you shall," said the rabbi, stroking his beard and thinking. "When is your bedtime?" "Mother sends me to bed at 9, but I never sleep before 10. "Well, come around to the back door here at 9:30, if you can manage to give your family the slip for a while, and you shall meet the fellow who interests you so much. That's a promise." "Of course," said the rabbi. "Don't tell anyone about him, will you? Things could get very complicated." "Of course, sir," said the little boy. "I know supernatural things are not to be revealed." That evening, as dusk was falling, young Abraham Stoker slipped out of his family home and walked down to the rabbi's house. Circling around to the back door, he knocked lightly. The rabbi's wife opened. "Ah, there you are, Abraham," she said. Then figures approached behind her. First was the rabbi, and then the most enormous man Abraham had ever seen, if man he was at all. He was all brownish grey, and his features seemed rudimentary, but he looked immensely strong. "Abraham," said the rabbi, "this is our golem, and I am taking him out to his evening's work at the cemetery. Golem, this young fellow means you no harm. He just wants to befriend you, so always remember to be nice to him." The golem looked at the boy in puzzlement, then nodded slowly. "Good, that's settled," said the rabbi. "Off we go. Come, golem. Come, Abraham." So they set out for the cemetery, and the golem took up his post, vanishing into the shadows. "You'd better go home now, Abraham," said the rabbi, "in case they miss you. Sleep well, and don't have any nightmares over our friend here." "Oh, no, sir," said the little boy. "I never have nightmares. It's because I make up stories. They're much more interesting than nightmares." The golem went about his work regularly, and soon enough there was no man or youth in Ballybough so daring as to try to help himself to a headstone from the Jewish cemetery. All the gangs of sack-em-ups had experienced a drubbing at the hands of the angry golem too, whether they were visiting the suicide plot or the Jewish cemetery itself, and young Abraham Stoker watched the golem on his guard duty when he went to bed at night, or if he happened to wake up during the night. Meanwhile, Mrs. Davidoff, the rabbi's wife, found the golem a useful man of all work around the house. There was no labouring job he could not do, and every so often she sent him out for buckets of water in the early morning or after dark. This did not escape Abraham's notice. One day, when he saw her in the back garden, he asked Mrs. Davidoff, "Doesn't the golem ever get tired?" No, she said. "That fellow has endless energy. He can keep going night and day." "Well, doesn't he have a day off?" "Our servants have a day off. Then my mother has to do the cooking." "Of course he does. He couldn't work on the Sabbath now, could he? God forbid." "Is that Sunday?" "No, our Jewish Sabbath begins on Friday as soon as it gets dark, and it lasts until Saturday night. No right-thinking Jew would do any work on the Sabbath." "Does the golem know when it's the Sabbath?" "He doesn't really have the brains to know. The rabbi looks after that. You saw the Hebrew letters on his forehead." "Why, yes. I don't know what it means, though." "It reads Aleph Mim Tav. That spells out Emet, a whole word, which means truth. But if the Aleph is missing, it spells out another word, Met, which means dead. Now, on the eve of every Sabbath, the rabbi calls him in and rubs out the Aleph on his forehead, so that he is dead. Well, he sleeps, I suppose. He's not alive. He's lying on a bed down in the cellar, and he doesn't stir all of Saturday. On Saturday night, the rabbi goes down and writes him a new Aleph. Then he gets up and is ready for another week." "That's what I'll call him then," said Abraham excitedly. "Emmet. That's the name of a famous Irish patriot in the old days. I thought he needed a name, not just golem, because that's just what he is. It doesn't say who he is. Let's call him Emmet." The rabbi had just come out of the house and was listening to this. He and his wife looked helplessly at one another. "All right," said the rabbi with a chuckle. "Emmet is what we'll call him then." The arrangement with the Aleph seemed to work well, and Emmet got his Sabbath rest as a pious Jew should. At least, it worked until just after the high holidays in September. The rabbi had been so busy with leading the services that, on the following Sabbath eve, he forgot to rub out the Aleph on Emmet's forehead. Whether it was from overwork or what, Emmet went on a rampage. First, he retraced his steps to the suicide plot, for a plan had long been forming in his dull mind during the long nights on guard duty at the cemetery, and now he meant to put it into action. He felt sorry for the suicides, thieves, murderers, highwaymen and the like, who had killed themselves or else died on the public gibbet. He thought it monstrously unfair that they should have stakes driven through their hearts, for he understood that this was to keep them immobile and prevent their ghosts from getting up and haunting the living. Well, why shouldn't they get up and haunt if they wanted to? Bringing a shovel from the Jewish cemetery, he dug open all the graves in the plot till he exposed the worm-eaten dead in their shrouds and took the stakes out of their hearts. Awoken by the commotion in the suicide plot, young Abraham Stoker had stood at his bedroom window and seen the goings-on. He knew this spelled trouble for the rabbi. The next morning, which was Saturday, he went over there. As he walked by the suicide plot, he could see it looked like a battlefield. He knocked at the rabbi's door. "Rabbi," he said, when the great man himself opened, "something terrible has happened. Emmet has gone on the rampage. He's dug up the whole suicide plot." The rabbi covered his face with his hands. "Dear God," he whispered, "I forgot to rub out his Aleph last night. Where is he now? Have you seen him?" I saw him at the suicide plot last night. He was digging up the graves. Then he disappeared. All during Saturday, there were sightings of a monstrous figure stalking the strands on the far side of Mud Island. He was even seen by sailors on passing ships. Everyone who saw him was terrified. That night, the ghosts of several suicides arose from their graves and, profiting by their newfound freedom, went into Dublin and proceeded to haunt the houses where they died and to frighten their families and neighbours out of their wits. They ran amok. They seemed to be intent on revenge, and they seemed to blame the living for having driven them to take their own lives. Meantime, Emmett came back after dark. He went down to a local hostelry and raided the tap room. It was after hours, but there were half a dozen drinkers still at their pints of porter under the watchful eye of the landlord. When they heard the banging at the locked door, they feared it was a raid by the peelers, but when the door was broken down by brute force, they realised it was something much worse. A huge monstrous figure strode into the tap room. The drinkers thought it must be the devil himself and fled with cries of terror, followed by the landlord, for even he was not sober at this stage. The golem strode up to the bar and served himself a measure of porter from the keg. Then another, and another. Finally, completely drunk, he left and headed back to the rabbi's house. The golem let himself in by the back door. It was very late. There was not a sound in the house. He felt lonely and didn't know where to go. It was the end of Sabbath, something he hadn't experienced so far in his brief existence. However, there was light flickering in the rabbi's study, so he went in there. Sure enough, there was a fire burning in the grate as always, and the room was warm. He saw the rabbi sitting in his armchair. He was fast asleep. Weary from his wanderings, and prompted by an instinct to imitate what he saw people doing, Emmett sat down in the armchair on the other side of the fireplace. Drowsy now because of the fire, he soon fell asleep himself. That evening, Mrs. Davidoff had gone to bed, but the rabbi was too worried to sleep yet, and he'd paced up and down his study, looking at his manuscripts and muttering to himself. Finally, he sat down by the glowing fire to think of a solution. So doing, he fell asleep from sheer exhaustion, for he was no longer a young man. Hours must have gone by, and then something woke him. He stared into the fire, tried to think, but paralysing inertia was still heavy on his brain, and he went back to sleep with a snore. After a few minutes, it could only have been a few minutes, he awoke again, sensing there was somebody there. He looked across and saw Emmett sitting in the other armchair. Emmett looked at him, troubled, and then looked away, seemingly ashamed. Or that was what seemed to the rabbi in his half-asleep state. He tried to bestir himself, but fell asleep again. A long time went by. He woke up and shivered, for the fire was burning low. He felt a hand on his shoulder. He looked up into the pale face of Bram Stoker. Young Abraham had not been able to sleep with excitement either, after all the news he'd heard. He knew just who it was who was on the rampage in and around Ballybough. He got up every so often and looked out his bedroom window. At one point, he saw a hulking figure approaching the rabbi's house and disappearing in the shadows there. "It's Emmett!" he exclaimed. Driven by insatiable curiosity, he got dressed, went downstairs, and slipped out of the house, where all were asleep. He ran in the moonlight past the suicide plot, past the Jewish cemetery, till he reached Rabbi Davidoff's. Then he went around to the back and tried the back door. It wasn't locked, as indeed he expected, so he slipped inside. There wasn't a sound in the house, but there was a flickering light coming from the rabbi's study. So he crept along the hall and went in there. There were two figures asleep in the armchairs before the fire, both of them snoring in a sort of counterpoint. When he looked, one was the rabbi and one was Emmett. Both of them were fast asleep. He tiptoed over to the rabbi and touched him on the shoulder. The rabbi woke up with a start. "Abraham," he whispered, "is that you?" "Yes, sir," he whispered breathlessly back. "Emmett's come home. He's here, asleep." The rabbi sat up and looked. Yes, there was Emmett, his great head reclining against the back of the chair, obviously sleeping off the prodigious amount of porter he had consumed at the inn. "Thanks be to God," whispered the rabbi. "I can make good my mistake. There's no time to be lost." He got up and tiptoed to his desk, where he found his penknife. Then he went across to the sleeping golem. They both bent over him. Then, using the butt of the penknife, the rabbi deftly erased the initial aleph from the monster's muddy forehead. "He'll sleep now," said the rabbi, quietly pleased with his work. "He'll sleep the sleep of the just." "What will you do with him now?" asked Abraham. The rabbi lit a lamp on his desk and sat down there. "Emmett has served his purpose, I think," he said broodingly. "He has solved the problem of the cemetery, to be sure, but I see now that he is too dangerous and can get out of hand." He sighed and then looked across at his creation with a trace of wistful fondness. "Yes, I think we will let him sleep on, sleeping the sleep of the just, until such time as the children of Israel need him again." He looked at his watch. "Already 4 o'clock in the morning," he murmured. Then he looked at Abraham. "Are you not tired, boy?" he asked. "Not a bit of it, sir," said Abraham. "Emmett gave us all some excitement, didn't he?" "He certainly did," said the rabbi. "Listen then, young Abraham. You can make yourself useful by going around to Mr. Pereira's and Mr. De Souza's. You know where they live, don't you?" Abraham nodded. "Knock them up, discreetly, mind you, so as not to waken the whole neighbourhood. And tell them I need them to come over here right away. Tell them it's about the golem. When they hear that, they'll come." So Abraham Stoker slipped out the back door and went into a nearby street. He found the first house and knocked. After a while, a sleepy Mr. Pereira stuck his head out an upstairs window. "Who's there?" he muttered hoarsely. "Mr. Pereira," came a voice from below. "It's Abraham, with a message from the rabbi. He says come quickly. It's about Emmett. The golem." Then Abraham went to De Souza's house and knocked. De Souza put his head out the window and received the same message. Abraham now headed back to the rabbi's, and as he got there, he could see the two men hurrying along behind him. "They're coming," said Abraham to the rabbi in the parlour. The rabbi was bending over the motionless form of Emmett asleep in the armchair, looking at his creation wistfully, or so it seemed. Then there was a knock at the front door, and the rabbi went to admit Pereira and De Souza. They came into the parlour, where a desk lamp and a fire were now brightly illuminating the scene, including Emmett asleep in the armchair. "There he is," they exclaimed, entering the room. "What a relief!" "Gentlemen," said the rabbi, "he is now sleeping the sleep of the just, and that is how I propose to leave him. I cannot take the risk of forgetting to scratch out the aleph from his brow. I've done it now, as you can see. He is met, yes? I sent Abraham here to call you because I need your help. We need to carry the golem down the stairs into the cellar and just leave him on the bed there. I do not propose to revive him. "That is," he said darkly. "Not unless you find more problems that need to be dealt with." The two men nodded. "Abraham," said the rabbi, "go and open the door to the cellar, will you?" Pereira and D'Souza looked at the boy doubtfully. "Young Abraham here knows how to keep a secret," the rabbi reassured them. "Just as well he's one of our own," said Pereira. Abraham was going to say something, but the rabbi put his hand on his shoulder. "Off you go now, Abraham. We'll follow with the golem." With Abraham guiding them and holding a lamp to light the way, the three men manhandled the golem down the steps to the cellar, and with great effort laid him out on the crude wooden bed that he had occupied. And there they left him, till kingdom come, for all they knew. On Monday morning, workmen were sent by Dublin Corporation to restore order at the suicide plot. This consisted of shoveling the mounds of disturbed earth into the graves, but first the workmen produced wooden stakes from their cart and hammered them into the bodies in their shrouds. While they were doing this, the gang of workmen realised they had an observer. It was a young boy who had climbed up to the top of the wall and was watching the whole operation. Not long afterwards, he came strolling through the gate as they were packing up their tools in the cart. The foreman said to him, "Here, lad, you shouldn't be looking at that. That's nothing for a young lad to know about. It's likely to give you nightmares." "Oh no, sir, I never get nightmares, but I know all about the suicide plot." "Yeah, what do you know about it?" "Well, that it's unconsecrated ground, and the suicides, thieves, murderers and highwaymen, after execution, are buried here. They have a stake through their hearts." "Right you are, lad. Why did they have a stake through their hearts?" The foreman looked around at his men. He shook his head helplessly at such a question. "Well, young lad," he said gravely, "they get stakes through their hearts to make sure they'll stay buried." "You mean they might get up again and walk around?" "Well, in a word, yes. They might start haunting the living. Some say they even turn into ghouls or vampires if they get a chance. Ever heard of them?" "No." "Well, probably just as well." "But what did you call them? Vampires? What are they?" "Aye, lad, that means a kind of ghost that harms the living." "The suicides were off in Dublin haunting the other night, weren't they? It's because, well, someone pulled all the stakes out of them." The foreman and the workers stared at young Abraham. "Aye," said the foreman, "some blackguard it was." "He didn't mean any harm," said Abraham. "He just felt sorry for them. I think that was it." The foreman nodded in bewilderment. "Maybe so," he said. "Well, our work is done, and we'll be off now. Go on home, lad, won't you?" A year went by, and the Jewish cemetery remained undisturbed. So did the suicide plot, as far as Abraham could tell. Then he saw some men starting to work at the cemetery under the direction of the rabbi, Mr. Pereira and Mr. D'Souza. He asked the rabbi, "Please, sir, what are you doing with the cemetery?" "Good news," said the rabbi. "We have got a gift of money from our brethren in London, and we are building a high wall around the cemetery. And there at the entrance there is going to be a fine little house for a gatekeeper who is going to watch over the place all the time." And so it was. During the spring and summer the wall went up and the little gate lodge was built. Mr. D'Souza was going to live there with his wife, the rabbi told Abraham, when they stood looking at the little house one day. The rabbi pointed out an inscription on the front of the house that he had just had made. It's in English, said the rabbi. Can you read it from here? Abraham read it off. Built in the year 5618. He turned to the rabbi. But sir, he said, it's 1857. Everybody knows that. The rabbi chuckled. Well, it depends on which calendar you are using, my boy. That is the Jewish calendar, which is dated from the creation of the world. That was now 5,618 years ago. Abraham thought for a moment. I have it, sir, he said suddenly. Hebrew is written backwards. So dates are too, isn't that it? Well, if you rearrange the numbers, it could be 18 and then 56. That would make 1856. Of course, it'd still be a year out of date. The rabbi guffawed. You're a smart young rascal, aren't you? But you get the idea about Hebrew. There's a whole field of study, young Abraham, which has to do with combining and recombining Hebrew letters. Why, a single aleph can make a world of difference. They say it did in the story of creation. And in the making of Emmet the Golem. Right, sir? Rabbi Davidoff smiled. He just put his finger to his lips. You've been listening to The Golem of Ballybough by Turlough Convey from 13 Tales Told by a Dubliner. If you've enjoyed the story, don't forget to like, subscribe, share and comment. And so, until next time.